Okay, so today we're tackling something pretty massive, a really ambitious idea from history,
Definitely
the
ambitious.
League of Nations.
Yeah.
And you sent over just a ton of material on this. I
I
did.
can.
So we're going to try to really just get a grasp on what this organization was, what it did, what it maybe didn't do so well, and really understand, this pivotal moment in global history.
Yeah, and looking back on it now, I think gives us a lot of perspective too for understanding, even challenges today with international cooperation.
For sure, for sure.
So yeah, diving into the League of Nations, and it was formed after World War I
Right.
with this really ambitious aim of preventing future wars and
Yeah.
resolving disputes between countries.
And really, in a lot of ways, like the precursor to the UN that we have
Yes,
today. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, a direct line you can draw between the two.
So this whole idea of like global peacemaker after such a devastating war,
Yeah.
it's a big idea. Where did that even come from?
Yeah. Well, you can trace it back to Woodrow Wilson, U.S. president,
Right.
and his 14-point speech in 1918.
Right.
This was sort of his vision for post-World War I peace.
Yeah.
And at the heart of it was this idea, we need some kind of international body
Yeah.
that can step in and resolve disputes between nations before they escalate into, horrific war.
Okay, so he's got this big idea.
Yeah.
How does he actually try to put that into action?
Well, so he goes to the Paris Peace Conference in 1919 with, this goal of incorporating his 14 points, including this League of Nations idea into the Treaty of Versailles.
Okay.
And, he really believed that this framework, this international framework, was essential to securing lasting peace.
Right.
And so he spends, several months there and then comes back to the U.S. with this treaty
Yeah.
that has the League of Nations, right there in it.
But not everyone was on board back home, were they?
Not everyone.
Oh.
No.
There was some pushback.
Yeah, you have Henry Cabot Lodge, who's a Republican congressman, who emerges as a really vocal critic of U.S. involvement in the League.
Okay.
And his main concern is this idea that by joining the League, the U.S. is going to be giving up too much of its sovereignty.
Yeah.
Too much of its autonomy, and it's going to get entangled in disputes that may not even directly involve the U.S.
Okay, yeah. So there's a tension there between, this idea of, working together for peace and then, like you said, sovereignty.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And even the architect of this, global peace organization can't convince his own country to kind of embrace that idea
Yeah.
of limitation on its autonomy that's required for this kind of collective security.
And Wilson, he's not a man to just like back down, is he?
No, he's not a man to back down. He goes on a 27-day speaking tour across the country,
Wow.
trying to rally public support for the treaty and for the League.
Okay.
But the strain is too much.
Yeah.
He has to cut the tour short. He gets sick. And then shortly after he returns to Washington, he has a stroke.
Wow.
And
That's a huge setback.
it is, yeah, it's a personal tragedy for him, but it also becomes a political tragedy for the League. Because ultimately, with him sidelined and with this growing isolationist sentiment in Congress,
Mm-hmm.
the U.S. Senate refuses to ratify the Treaty of Versailles, and so the U.S. never joins the League.
So, like, right out of the gate, you've got this major player that's not even participating.
Yeah.
But what about other countries?
Well, there was, in many other nations, there was quite a bit of enthusiasm for the League.
Okay.
In Britain, Lord Cecil sort of leads the charge, and they form this Phillimore Committee
Okay.
to really examine the proposal. And they ultimately recommend, Britain supporting it.
Okay.
French liberals were largely in favor, and then leaders in other countries like Sweden, Switzerland, Belgium, Greece, Czechoslovakia all responded really positively.
It seems like, the horrors of the war were still very much on people's minds.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the desire for some new mechanism to manage international relations was very strong.
So despite, the U.S. not joining the League does actually become a reality.
It is, yeah.
Right.
In 1919, they formalized the whole thing in the Covenant of the League of Nations, and this is a document that's developed collaboratively by all the participating countries
Okay.
at the Paris Peace Conference. And they actually begin setting up shop that fall initially in London for about 10 months.
All right.
And then they relocate to Geneva.
All right.
And the covenant officially goes into effect on January 10th, 1920.
Okay.
And by the end of that year, they've got 48 countries that have signed on as members.
Wow. So they're up and running.
They're up and running in Geneva.
What are some of the immediate challenges they face trying to put this ideal into practice?
Well, one of the biggest challenges early on is just establishing their authority,
Okay.
their credibility
Right.
on the world stage.
Because if no one's taking them seriously, then they're not going to be very effective.
Exactly. And so the first Secretary General, a guy named Sir Eric Drummond, he advocates for a very cautious approach in those first few years.
Yeah.
Because his concern is that if the league jumps into these disputes too quickly
Yeah.
and has some early failures,
Yeah.
it's going to damage their legitimacy in the long run.
That makes sense. So, do we have any examples of this like cautious approach in action?
Yeah, so in 1920, Persia, which is modern-day Iran,
Okay.
they come under attack by Russia.
Hmm.
Now, importantly, Russia is not a member of the League at this point,
Okay.
and so Persia appeals to the League for help.
Okay.
But the League ultimately decides not to get involved militarily,
Okay.
largely because their feeling is that Russia's not a member.
Yeah.
They're probably just going to ignore whatever the League tries to do,
Yeah.
and that would be a really bad precedent to set early on.
Right. So they're kind of trying to pick their battles a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they want to be a force for peace, but they're also very aware of the limitations of their power at
Yeah.
this point
Okay.
and the potential for their authority to be disregarded.
And what about like within the member states themselves? Were there issues there with the league's role?
Yeah, another challenge was that a lot of these European countries, they were reluctant to really give up control when they asked the League for help.
It makes sense.
They wanted help with these disputes, but they weren't always so keen on surrendering their own national decision-making power to this new organization.
Okay, so understandable hesitation there.
Yeah, for sure.
But I mean, the league wasn't completely inactive, right? They did get involved in trying to resolve certain conflicts.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And there were some successes. One example is the Saar region.
Oh.
So this is a small but economically important area between France and Germany.
Okay.
Lots of coal mines there.
Okay.
And from 1919 to 1935, the League actually served as a trustee for this region.
Oh.
So they administered it for 15 years
Okay.
with the understanding that eventually there would be a vote,
Okay.
a plebiscite, to let the people decide whether they want to join France or Germany.
Okay.
And in 1935, that vote happens, and it's overwhelmingly in favor of Germany.
Okay.
So this is often seen as one of the League's, more straightforward successes.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like a pretty peaceful resolution.
Yeah, and just to kind of highlight, the League actually oversaw that plebiscite process.
Okay.
So that shows you kind of a concrete example of them, actually operationally involved in resolving an international issue.
So they weren't just like talking, they were actually doing stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
Were there other situations where they played like a similar administrative role?
Yeah. There was Danzig,
Okay.
which was declared a free city under the Treaty of Versailles.
Okay.
It's situated between Germany and Poland, and it becomes a real point of contention between those two countries.
Okay.
The League administers Danzig for a number of years,
Okay.
try to balance, the competing interests there.
Yeah.
But ultimately, as tensions rise in the lead up to World War II, Danzig ends up being annexed by Germany.
Okay. So a bit more of a mixed bag in that case.
Yeah, more of a mixed bag.
And what about like direct disputes between countries? I mean, how effective was the League in actually stepping in, preventing or resolving those kinds of conflicts?
Well, Poland in particular kept the League pretty busy.
Okay. How so?
Well, they had a lot of territorial and border disputes in this period,
Yeah.
and the League was often called upon to try to, mediate.
Okay.
So, for example, in 1920, there was a situation where Russia occupied this city, Vilna,
Okay.
and then handed it over to Lithuania.
Okay.
And the League, is advocating for Lithuanian independence.
Right.
And they're saying, Poland,
Yeah.
you need to recognize Lithuania.
Okay.
Eventually, Vilna does end up back in Polish hands,
Okay.
but it causes a lot of tension between Poland and Lithuania for years to come.
Yeah. So like, I'm sensing a theme here.
What's that?
Like these are really complex situations
Absolutely.
with like deep historical roots,
Absolutely.
lots of nationalistic tensions,
Yeah.
and it's hard to imagine any international body like fully resolving that.
Yeah. I mean, it's a constant challenge, right? For
Yeah.
the League to navigate these really, entrenched interests in these historical claims.
So Poland was like a recurring problem for the League, but were there other conflicts that they got involved in?
Oh, yeah. All over the place.
Okay, give us some examples.
Well, you had Finland and Sweden
Okay.
arguing over these islands called the Island Islands.
Okay.
You had Hungary and Romania in conflict.
Mm-hmm.
Finland had issues with Russia, Yugoslavia, Austria.
Oh.
There was a border argument between Albania and Greece. And even France and England got into it over Morocco.
So they were busy.
They were
So
busy.
it sounds like they had some success with these smaller disputes, especially when the countries involved were kind of willing to play ball.
Right.
But what happened when like a major power was involved and just flat out refused to cooperate with the League?
Yeah, well, that was a major problem. And the Corfu incident in 1923 is a really good example of that.
What happened there?
So an Italian general, Enrico Tellini, and some of his staff,
Okay.
they were assassinated on Greek territory.
Okay.
And Mussolini, who was the leader of Italy at the time,
Right.
he reacts by bombing and then invading the Greek island of Corfu.
Wow. Okay, so major escalation.
Yeah, I mean, this is a serious international incident.
Right.
And Greece appeals to the League for help.
Right.
But Mussolini just refuses to cooperate with the League.
Okay, so they're basically just ignored.
Pretty much, yeah.
Wow. So what happens? I mean, how does that get resolved?
Well, it actually ends up getting resolved not through the League, but through this other body called the Conference of Ambassadors,
Okay.
which was kind of this leftover from World War I, but it had become sort of integrated into the League structure in a way.
Okay.
But the fact that a solution had to be found outside the League
Yeah.
really highlights the limits of their power when a major nation just decides to go its own way.
So it's like if a country is determined to kind of throw its weight around,
Yeah,
there's not a whole lot the League can do.
exactly.
But there was that other incident you mentioned involving Greece, the incident at Petrich,
Right.
and that one had a different outcome, right?
It did. Yeah, that one's a bit more of a positive story.
Okay, so tell us about that one.
So this is 1925,
Okay.
and it's a border clash between Bulgaria and Greece.
Okay.
A Greek captain gets killed in this town called Petrich, right on the border.
Okay.
Greece retaliates by sending troops into Bulgaria.
Okay.
Now, in this case, Bulgaria immediately apologizes, and they appeal to the League for help.
Okay, so they're engaging with the process.
Yeah, they're saying, we want the League to help us sort this out.
Okay.
And so the League condemns the Greek invasion,
Okay.
demands that Greece pull back their troops, and they send a commission to investigate what happened.
Okay.
And Greece actually complies.
Oh.
They pull back their troops, and they end up reaching a financial settlement with Bulgaria.
Okay, so a more positive outcome there.
Yeah, and it shows that when the parties involved are actually willing to work with the League and abide by its decisions,
Right.
it can actually be an effective mechanism for, preventing further conflict.
So it sounds like they had a better chance of success in these smaller disputes,
Yeah.
particularly when the nations involved actually respected the League's authority.
Right.
But aside from these individual conflicts, were there any like broader initiatives that the League was working on to try to prevent future wars?
Yeah, there were a couple of notable efforts. One was the Geneva Protocol in the 1920s, and this was an attempt to limit and eventually prohibit the use of chemical and biological weapons.
Okay, so like what we would today call weapons of mass destruction.
Exactly. But unfortunately, the protocol never gained enough support to really go into effect.
Okay.
Then in the 1930s, there's this big push for disarmament.
Okay.
So there's this World Disarmament Conference.
Okay.
The goal is to get countries to significantly reduce their military forces.
Okay.
But this effort completely falls apart.
Why?
Well, in 1933, Hitler pulls Germany out of the conference and out of the League.
Wow. Okay, so that's a major setback for the League.
It is, yeah, and a pretty clear sign of, the growing instability in Europe at that time.
Right. I mean, it's almost like the world is starting to like unravel.
Yeah, you can really sense that things are heading in a bad direction.
And what about the territories that were placed under mandate after World War I?
Right.
Did the League have a role in overseeing those?
They did, yeah. So they set up this Mandates Commission in 1920. And the commission's job was to make sure that the countries that were administering these mandates
Okay.
were protecting the rights of the people who lived there.
Okay.
And the commission's recommendations, they were taken seriously by some of the colonial powers, like France and Belgium, in their African territories.
Okay.
But other powers, like South Africa, they weren't so receptive to the commission's oversight.
Okay. So kind of a mixed bag there.
Yeah, bit of a mixed bag. But there was an interesting case in 1929 where the Mandates Commission actually played a role in getting Iraq admitted to the League of Nations.
Oh, wow. Okay. So that suggests that they were at least somewhat successful in helping to guide some of these territories towards independence.
Yeah, it does.
And what about Palestine?
Right, so Palestine was a British mandate at this time,
Okay.
and things were getting increasingly tense there.
Right, between the Jewish and Arab populations?
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a conflict that has obviously continued to this day.
Yeah, a really difficult situation.
And was the League involved in trying to address that?
Yeah, the Mandates Commission was definitely involved,
Okay.
trying to navigate this really complex and volatile situation.
Yeah.
You had this growing Jewish immigrant population, and then you had the existing Palestinian Arab population,
Mhm.
and tensions were just boiling over.
Right.
And then, to make matters worse,
Yeah.
you had the Nazi persecution of Jews in Europe starting,
Right.
which led to even more Jewish immigration to
Yeah.
Palestine.
Right.
So it just further exacerbated the conflict, and despite the League's efforts, it ultimately couldn't prevent the situation from, continuing to deteriorate.
And then there was that treaty that was supposed to outlaw war altogether, the Kellogg-Briand Pact.
Oh yeah, that was a really ambitious undertaking.
Yeah. So tell us about that.
So it's this multilateral treaty signed in 1928,
Okay.
and the countries that signed it basically agreed that they would renounce war as an instrument of national policy.
Okay. Sounds good in theory.
Yeah, that's right.
But I mean, how do you actually enforce that?
Well, that's exactly the problem. And a good example of that is what happens in 1931 when Japan invades Manchuria,
Okay.
which was part of Mongolia at the time.
Right.
The League condemns the invasion,
Okay.
but they're powerless to actually do anything about it.
Right, because they don't have their own army.
Exactly.
Right.
They're reliant on the member states
Right.
to enforce their decisions.
Right. And those member states often have their own agendas.
Exactly.
Right.
And that's a problem that we still see today with, international law and these attempts to create these global bodies that can actually, enforce rules.
It's like, how do you get countries to act in the collective interest when it might conflict with their own individual interests?
Right. It's the fundamental challenge.
Yeah. So despite, some lofty goals and even some successes with smaller conflicts, it seems like the League just ultimately couldn't prevent the world from sliding back into another major war.
Yeah, that's the sad truth.
So how does the outbreak of World War II actually lead to the League's demise?
Well, when war breaks out in 1939, it essentially paralyzes the League.
Okay.
A lot of the member states, they declare neutrality.
Okay.
But obviously key members like France and Germany are immediately involved in the fighting.
Right.
And then as the war goes on,
Yeah.
and as the Axis powers start gaining ground,
Okay.
especially after a bunch of countries fall to Nazi Germany in 1940, places
Right.
like Denmark, Norway, Luxembourg, Belgium,
Right.
the Netherlands, France,
Right.
the League's position just becomes more and more untenable.
Right. I mean, the whole world is changing around them.
Exactly. And Switzerland, which is where the League is headquartered in Geneva,
Right.
they start getting really nervous about hosting this organization that's seen as being aligned with the Allies.
So it's almost like the League is becoming a liability for them.
Yeah, pretty much.
So as the war rages on, the League just kind of starts to fall apart.
Yeah, basically they start dismantling their offices in Geneva.
Okay.
And at the same time, the Allied powers are already starting to talk about creating a new international organization,
Okay.
one that they hope will be, more effective at maintaining peace after the war.
Right.
So the idea of the UN starts to take shape. And in 1944, they have their first planning conference in San Francisco.
And that's pretty much the end for the League.
Yeah, the writing's on the wall at that point.
So this organization that was born out of, so much hope after World War I kind of fades away in the midst of another world war.
It's kind of a tragic story when you think about it.
It really is. I mean, it's a reminder that peace is really fragile.
Yeah,
And it takes constant effort to maintain it.
absolutely. And, the League's journey from Woodrow Wilson's, idealism to its eventual dissolution,
Mhm.
I think it really highlights the challenges of international cooperation,
Right.
especially in a world that was, still dealing with the aftermath of this horrific war
Yeah.
and where nationalism was still so strong.
So the League had its successes.
Yeah.
It managed to resolve some smaller conflicts.
Yeah.
And it laid some important groundwork
Yeah, this set some precedents.
for future international organizations like the UN.
For sure.
But ultimately, it just couldn't prevent another major war.
Yeah. And it couldn't really effectively enforce its decisions when push came to shove.
Right. It all comes back to that issue of enforcement.
Yeah. How do you get countries to prioritize the collective good over their own self-interest?
Right. It's a question that's still relevant today.
Absolutely.
So I guess a good question for our listeners to think about is,
Yeah.
what do you think are the essential elements that any international organization needs to have
Yeah.
to really effectively maintain global peace and security?
Right. Because the League's experience shows us that it's not enough to just have good intentions.
Exactly. It's a question that's just as relevant and challenging today as it was a century ago.
It really is. It
Yeah.
makes you think, what have we learned from the League's successes and failures.
Yeah.
And how can we apply those lessons to the challenges we face in our own time?
Food for thought for sure.
Definitely.
All right, well, that's our deep dive into the League of Nations.
Fascinating stuff.
Thanks for joining us,
Always a pleasure.
and we'll see you next time on the Deep Dive.
See you then.